Let's shift to PTSD. I'm covering a lot of the anxiety disorders in spots, but I was fortunate to do a book on PTSD with somebody at the VA. She's very involved in the emergency response system here in San Francisco, and I invited her into the book, and because she knew more about PTSD than I said, why don't you be the senior author? And I learned a lot in writing this book with Victoria Beckner. Here's a summary of what we know about PTSD. You know, a lot of lore about what happens with people that have been traumatized. And the big lore, certainly during the early 90s, is too much trauma, too much cortisol, shrunken hippocampus. Well, actually, you know what? Actually, later was found was that if you have a premorbid smaller hippocampus, you can be vulnerable to PTSD. So it's not like one way, it's interactive. And that became what is regarded as the so-called vulnerability hypothesis. You can have a shrunken hippocampus before you even get there. And how this came about was we knew that some Vietnam vets that had combat exposure had shrunken hippocampus, but their brother, the monozygotic twin, didn't have combat, had a small hippocampus too. Well, what do you do with these people? What you want to do, even if they are vulnerable to more exposure, and I'm a person that came from a family that was heavily traumatized. I'm an Armenian, and my family in years past was, you know, involved in a very terrible genocide, and I heard horrible stories. Tried to understand, how did my relatives emerge and become functional human beings and have kids and everything else? How did they put it into context? Some were overreactive, some didn't really survive very well, and whenever they saw a Turk, they overreacted, like my grandfather. Well, what do we do? Well, it's how you put these fear networks into perspective. Edna Foa, has anybody heard of Edna Foa? Done a lot of work with not only PTSD, but also with OCD and other anxiety disorders. Talked about fear networks. Now, remember what we were talking about earlier relative to memory. Two memory systems, implicit memory and explicit memory. Well, she's kind of only talking about the explicit memory portion of it. So later researchers said, well, you know, you're right about the semantic memory. Semantic memory, more putting into words and putting into context, but there's another part of it that's really important to these so-called fear networks, and those are the situationally accessible memories. And this, in many ways, is related to implicit memory. When you're talking about the amygdala, you're talking about situations that cause overactivity. Now we've got 20,000 people from the Iraq and now Afghani wars with PTSD, and we don't know what to do with it, and the VA system is scrambling, so they're developing new treatment modalities that incorporate some of these situational accessible memory kind of focuses. So when you get somebody with PTSD, what do? Well, a lot of clamor about EMDR lately. So I came to the VA people and I said, well, what do you think about EMDR? And you know what the reaction was? Oh my God, come on now, all that is exposure. I said, well, don't you think that there's maybe some bilateral activation or something like that going on? Because, you know, since Francine Shapiro moved from the movement of the eyes back and forth with the finger like that, now some people are doing this tapping of the legs and calling it cortical integration. Victoria and others in Washington at the VA said, again, you know, you're not getting that much cortical integration. All you're doing is you have an expectancy set, a situation where it's a supportive environment, and you're doing some exposure work. Maybe it is effective, at least on that line. The patient has an expectancy set that something's going to be going on, but actually the research from the Institutional Medicine has found basically that it's prolonged exposure that is the most restorative over a period of time. Prolonged exposure. And cognitive processing theory. Well, where does that come in? you got to kind of rewire a narrative about what happened to you. That's the way you integrate those memories. What did my relatives do? They put in perspective what happened to them and how they're going to not sit around and lick their wounds to death, but actually go on and be functional adults in later life. So you're incorporating, even within some of this, the expectancy set, the exposure, and the cognitive reprocessing in the EMDR context. But here's the issue around with, let's say you're out in the field. What we know is too early exposure to the memories and digging them up is actually destructive. So what do? You're out there on one of those smash units or something, and somebody comes in, his Humvee blew up. Carlos, his good buddy, was blown, and burnt to a crisp as he crawled out of the Humvee, and now he can't handle the smell of burning flesh. Like, can't even go by a McDonald's or McJack Jr.'s and not have a panic attack, so to speak. What you don't want to do is have too early exposure to the details, because your hippocampus cooks in those memories. So what you do is do what many people call psychological first aid. Say, hey, you know what? You went through a real traumatic experience, and what we're really going to want to do is support you over a period of time. These are some of the things that are going to happen over the next couple weeks. We're going to be following you over the next couple weeks, but you're going to have probably some nightmares. It's okay. It's very normal. So you're normalizing all the symptoms, so when they have them, then they know you already, said they were going to have them. It's only later that, as the hippocampus captured some memories, because you're not cooking in those memories right away, then you get into the cognitive reprocessing. And then you try to integrate all of that by making sense, writing a new narrative. You don't want to do that right away, because you overexcite those networks. Remember the difference between the somatic sort of memories and implicit memories versus the verbal part of it. You hook up the verbal too quick, and what you're doing is you're cooking in all these memories that they're going to be a nuisance later on. Some researchers have talked a lot about what to do later, and what to do later relates to post-traumatic growth with PTSD. Great example is Polly Klaas's dad. What did he do after the terrible loss of his daughter? He went out and started this foundation, made sense of his experience by trying to help others. Mothers Against Drunk Driving, same concept. Lost a loved one as a result of a drunk driver. They go ahead and go beyond that, so you integrate the past, making sense and leaping beyond. That's post-traumatic growth. Victims of the Holocaust, or the genocide in what was Armenia, or whatever, Rwanda. You make sense of what you've experienced. My co-author for the PTSD book went to Rwanda and talked for 4 days on PTSD. And very interestingly, there are some groups in Rwanda that are making alliances with some of the victimizers before, and this incredible art is coming out. I have a couple beautiful pieces of artwork that came out of some of these collectives. What they're trying to make sense of the integration and jumping beyond, that they're trying to make a better society in a sense. Rather than sitting around licking your wounds doesn't help PTSD. So in a sense, this post-traumatic growth concept is rewiring the narrative and coming up with a different vision of who you are as a traumatized person. That's a brain-based concept, because you're coming up with a new schema of what has happened to you, but you're enabling yourself to move ahead and be a far more functioning adult later on.